I'm Orlando Jones, and I just want you to know that the Moana Nui Podcast will be starting soon. Stay tuned, yo.
I'm Veronica Taylor, and from myself and Ash Ketchum, I just want to say, Moana Nui, I choose you!
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moana Nui Podcast. I know for those that have tuned in before, you know what time it is. We have Rain Talks going on this particular evening at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern. So we're very excited. If you've seen the post and everything about today's episode, Shae is going to dive into talking about functional versus dysfunctional family dynamics. So, of course, as y'all are tuning in, definitely engage in the chat. If you have questions or anything for her, please post them. And that way we can definitely engage with some of your questions or things. And of course, we always say, if it's too personal, send a message to Shae on any of the social medias that we post and let her know that you need to set an appointment and y'all can talk about it. So, with that, we're going to go ahead and dive in and talk with Shae Reigns, LMSW. And first of all, we're going to start off with, as we had in the post, the definition of what is considered functional family dynamics versus dysfunctional family dynamics.
Yeah. So, hi everybody. Just jumping right on in. Whatever you think is dysfunctional, you're probably wrong. There are a lot of things, of course, that are kind of obviously, or not necessarily obviously, but definitely dysfunctional. But there are some things that are, we would say, within the range of normal, if you want to use that word. I don't usually use that word, but things that we would expect in a family. You know, we're all human beings and individuals. And so things like arguing, that's going to happen. Things like disagreements, or we'll call we'll say an even level of discord, would fall into something that we would expect in any dynamic of human beings interacting. It's when it goes to the extreme and it's not actually, we'll say, progressive. So for the purpose of our conversation, because you can look up the word dysfunctional and figure out what that means. But for the purpose of our discussion, we're going to say that dysfunctional, when it comes to a family dynamic, is a dynamic that actually does not in any way really work together. So we're going to say that a functional family dynamic is one that actually allows for working together, kind of like as a family team. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, with, you know, with the, like you said, the dysfunctional, a lot of times it's, like you said, it's different than what we think. And I know one thing that I see online is people talking about of breaking those family curses, like dealing with how the interaction with a boomer family parents or older family members that is still of that mindset, you know, what I say goes, you don't talk, you don't talk. And with dysfunctional family dynamics, Are there degrees of dysfunctional? Because we'll hear that story and then we hear really, somebody going through something different. Is it degrees, or as a therapist, do y'all see it in a different way of like layers, degrees, or something of dysfunctional that you could be
Yeah,
experiencing? Okay.
yeah, definitely. We can say there's like degrees or levels of extreme. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we can say there's like basic level dysfunction, which that's where you're going to come in with where people just don't talk to each other. That's kind of
Okay.
we'll say a typical basic level of dysfunction, so to speak, where they don't talk to each other. And so because they're not really communicating, whether it's needs, feelings, thoughts, emotions, what have you, because they're not actually communicating, um, that's why the family isn't functioning as a unit, because there's no communication. It's like um, trying to turn on a light switch. You can't turn on the
Mm.
light switch if there's nothing back there connected, right?
Yeah.
The light switch won't come on if it's not connected to anything. And it's the same concept when it comes to family. So if you're not communicating, um, you're not going to have that functional ability.
Yeah.
And so, therapeutically speaking, what we would do is we would be getting the communication going and working and learning how to communicate properly as a family unit. So, where you're dealing with that kind of a situation where somebody's just like, I talk, you listen,
Mm-hmm.
that's basic level dysfunction. Not necessarily because, there's no exchange, so to speak, but also because there's a certain level of boundary that's being
Mm-hmm.
set there that is also going to be detrimental for the individual who is, let's say, for example, always on the listening side of things. They're setting that person up to not be able to, or not necessarily not be able to, but be less able to express themselves openly in situations where they probably need to be able to express themselves. You
Mm.
know, if your elders have always made all the decisions for you and you haven't had an opportunity to actually exercise your decision making muscles because all you ever did was listen and do what they said, you're going to have difficulties later on actually making some of those decisions yourself.
Mm.
So those
Mm-hmm.
are the kinds of things, like on a as in terms of uh, grades or levels or on a spectrum, depending on how you want to look at it. Yes, there's definitely levels, because on the most extreme level of dysfunction, we would put things like extreme abuse, whether that's
Mm-hmm.
physical, mental, emotional, sexual, financial abuse, because that's a thing, especially when we're talking about, the older generations,
Yes.
um, where you are, let's say, an adult child taking care of your parents, right? Financial abuse happens so often in that kind of a dynamic, because maybe the social security check is being deposited directly to the now adult child's account for management, and the parents' needs aren't actually being met by the money that, or the funding that is being provided for them through Social Security and
Mm.
things like that. So uh, there's several different levels of dysfunction, definitely. And in the extreme, that's where we get to abusive things. We can get to exploitation. We can get to, I mean, death, if we
Mm-hmm.
go all the way, you know,
Yeah.
um, where family members die, especially when we're talking about elders.
Yeah.
But, that's just keeping it with the progression from not so good to absolutely horrendous of a family member.
Mm-hmm. So you were how you were saying about like the older generation. Um, we often see on the internet, like people talking about like family dynamics is not like what it was back in the day and everything, but when you kind of dig into those dynamics, you kind of see that the dynamic is being looked at with rose-colored glasses in a way. Um, and how in a way can we break that misconceived notion that grandma was always happy? She stayed through thick and thin, and that's that's what it's supposed to be.
I love this question. Um, Having this conversation is a great way of dispelling that um, that misconception, because when it comes down to it, um, human rights are a thing for a reason. And
Mm,
back then, a lot of times the reason why grandma didn't leave is because literally she could not. She did not have anywhere else to go. She didn't actually even necessarily have the choice of who it is she married in the first place. She was told, this is who you're going to marry. In some cultures, she would have been told and sold to the other family, like literally, where there would be a payment exchanged, dowry, whatever you want to call it, in order
mhm,
to exchange this female child into another person's family, because women were seen as financial and or social burdens, and thus they needed to be sold and paid for in order to be worth anything.
mm,
um, so this idea that, oh, things need to go back to the way how they were is right up there with let's make America great again. Great for whom? For whomst? Okay. The reason why things aren't working out that way anymore is because we have rights,
mhm,
and we have equal duty. And
yes,
quite frankly, if things really did go back to the way they used to, it would not work, because in today's economy, most households require at least two incomes. If you want
mhm,
things to go back to the way how it was, and most of these are sirs, but there's some ma'ams out there too, and some in betweens. Um,
mhm,
if you really want things to go back to the way how it used to be, then you have to be able to actually financially provide at the same level as two incomes would. And since we're talking to our fellow brown folk, statistically speaking, that is not happening. The median income for, let's say, a black male these days is somewhere around $40,000 a year. $40,000 a year is not even enough, speaking in, let's say, Atlanta, to really be able to get approved um, for a lease on a 2 or more bedroom apartment. You would have to be making on your own, at the very least, somewhere close to $60,000 to $70,000 a year, just to be able
mhm,
to get and we're talking about in an okay neighborhood, not necessarily where you're going to be hearing gunshots all the time and so forth. I mean, if that kind of thing it doesn't bother you, then by all means, please, you know, go that
do
route.
you?
But if we're talking about, living the so-called American dream based on yesteryear's standard, you need to be making at least $70,000 a year at the very least in order to just get approved for a 2 bedroom or more apartment in Atlanta. Anyway, I can't speak for the
Mhm,
Midwest. If we travel further up the coast, we get a little bit more expensive, um, or we stay around the same. If we go down to Florida, I know that about a 2 bedroom apartment and the median income down there is even lower.
mhm,
And so, the median income is even lower, but the cost of living is the same.
yes,
So if you want to be able to go back to yesteryear with today's standards, you're going to have a very hard time. You're going to have to actually live up to yesteryear's standard by being the primary breadwinner, by paying for all of the bills, by all, and also because not in yesteryear, being respectful, household, and so forth and so on. Treating your significant other of any kind, if you, just because you are the primary breadwinner, again, because we have rights and because we can leave if we want to, you have to be able to hold up the entirety of your end of the bargain if that's what you are going for. And most human beings can't do that kind of multitasking because you have to pick a struggle. Either you want to live today with all of today's amenities, or live in yesteryear and, you know, maybe you give up cable TV and cell phones and, you know, and a 2-car home and so forth and so on in order to live in that time period, because that's the way, that's basically the only way how it's going to work.
Yes, exactly.
It's just not possible. It's and okay, it may be possible, but we shouldn't be looking to move backwards. We should be looking to move forward. We should be looking to actually make our relationships work for all of us and not just one of us.
Yes.
Because in a relationship, when everybody is actually working together as a functional dynamic, you get happy families, not just happy daddies or happy mommies. You get happy children. You get kids who can actually function properly in a school environment, or who can be homeschooled and, you know, do that thing, whatever that case may be, that where there's less trauma getting thrown around when people are actually working functionally in their relationships. So expecting, you know, 19 mentalities. Well, back in the 50s, by the way, wasn't that like the height of Jim Crow? like, again, if we're talking to our fellow brown people, like, if that's what you're trying to go back to, it would be great if you were to re-examine what it is that you're really looking at. Because the dynamic that you're looking at is a social dynamic that wasn't functional for any of us. Not men, not women, not the children. People were getting hosed out in the street and chased by dogs. Oh, wait, we still have some of that. Okay, my bad. What are you really asking for?
It's like, I want my cake and eat it too. But it's like, or my favorite is, the grass is greener on the other side, but you don't see what all is involved to keep that grass as green. And then the funny part is, like how you mentioned about that, it's like, I saw last month during International Women's Month, women weren't allowed to have checking accounts until the 80s. 80s. This was only 40 years ago. We were allowed to have checking accounts. So grandma, shoot, even your mama couldn't even be able to have a checking account to get a car, to get a house on her own, without having somebody co-signing or backing her, because it's not there. So
And specifically a man, because we want to say these things in today's vacuum of, you know, women's rights and LGBTQA apostrophe, like, we, or not apostrophe, I'm sorry, asterisks or whatever. We want to be able to say these things, but that is just not the world that we're living in today. And so if your auntie and her significant other, wife person, are out there trying to make ends meet, and you're out here lobbying to have us go back to the 50s, well, your auntie and her wife are going to be in a really bad place, because they're going to have to depend on you, man person, to be able to fit the bill, or to be able to provide the bank accounts for all of that.
Yep.
You know, your sister and your youngest sister, and, you know, like, what are you really asking for? Because when it comes down to it, you think you're asking for something, but what you're actually asking for, and this is from the mental health perspective, what you're really asking for is to be allowed to have a certain level of authority just by existing and not by actually doing.
Yep.
Unfortunately, the greater majority of the people who are having this argument are not the people who have, let's say, who are actually, making, let's say, six-figure incomes or whatever. People who are making six-figure incomes don't have these concerns. They're like, okay, she wants to go out there and be a boss chick. I support that. Like, that's what you hear in that environment. This argument is really only happening among poorer people.
Exactly. So, and it dives more into, like you said, those family dynamics that, like you were saying, of the grandma, mom, they had to suck it up and deal with it. They couldn't go back home because it was frowned upon to go back home if you're not in the ideal situation. And then on top of that, most places wouldn't hire a woman because until First World War, they needed women to come into the workforce to sustain businesses while the men were off to war. So, but
And
until
drafts,
then, women was frowned upon for that. So it's just like, okay.
what are you really asking for?
hmm And it seems like with the dysfunctional dynamic, it ties back into even what these guys are asking for too, is it seems like the common area is a form of control, whether it's controlling them through verbal abuse, whether it's physical abuse, controlling finances, like you said, all that is a form of control that puts the other person in a lesser state because of what you are doing or putting on upon them or something like that. So, for
Well, I do want
someone
to
that,
let me say this, because I think it's important not necessarily to give a pass to abusers, because that's
hmm
not the objective here. But when it comes to this particular argument, I think it's also important to recognize, um, more often than not, what we're dealing with when we're having this conversation about, wanting to go back to yesteryear and stuff. We're talking about a population of men and boys, um, who are dealing with a great deal of insecurities, a laundry
hmm
list of insecurities, and it often having to do with whether or not they can actually measure up. And so the behaviors that we see in these situations, some of these abuses have to do with that idea of what it means to be a man and being able to fit whatever that definition is for, let's say, that group of men. Because when it comes down to
hmm
it, socially speaking, how we define ourselves is greatly defined by how we are seen within our tribes, whether that's
hmm
our work tribe, our family tribe, our social tribe, our friends. And so how we measure up in comparison to, in a side by side analysis or statistical analysis or wherever you want to look at, how it is that we measure up to the other men or women or what have you in our tribes. And
hmm
so when you are seeing, let's say, for example, your three best friends achieving a certain level of whatever they think they're seeing, it's, do I measure up to this, or I want my life to look like that? Or, um, where, especially today in today's society, we're not necessarily just limited to our most immediate tribe. We're
hmm
also getting to see like NFL football players, or the guys on GQ, or random artist number 5. These we'll say famous people also, and trying to measure up to what it is that they have. or what it is that they seem to have achieved, and not being able to in your own realm. Right. And so you're looking at these, not I usually start with these young people, but we're not talking about only young men. We're talking about almost the full
The
gamut,
30,
up until
40,
about
50-year-olds.
40s, 50s. I've heard some 50-year-olds going there too, and I'm just like, sirs, like what?
Yeah.
Like, how is this a problem you're having? But yeah, because in my not near 50 yet life right now, I would think, where I actually got to look at the studies and so forth, that once you get to 50, you learn things and you're doing better and you figure stuff out. And no, that's not how that works at all. That's not how that works at all. So yeah, there are 50s, and I would say right now we're actually dealing with a very interesting situation with men, where even getting closer to the 60 level, we're still dealing with some of this very limited worldview, we'll call it. And so making these comparisons to, the Richie riches of the world or whatever, and wanting to be able to have those things, or have that level of, we'll say, relationship success, if you want to call it that, where you can basically pick whoever it is that you want and treat them however it is that you want. And because you have all the money, they just shut up and take it. That's not the reality for the greater majority of men. The greater majority of men have, especially because when we're talking about our fellow brown folk, BIPOC community, we are still, as of for the last decade, the most highly educated, highly employable population of women that these here United States of America, and in some other countries as well, have met. And so when we're talking about women going out there and getting educations, and yeah, maybe you have a couple kids, but you're still actually making more money in some cases than your male counterparts. The preschool to prison pipeline affected so many Black and brown boys over the last 30 years, having severely diminished employability and mental health and financial stability throughout the entirety of the BIPOC community. When we're looking at these things, women have had to, as they used to say, hold it down. And so when you're coming back into an environment where the women don't need you for what it is you have been taught they need you for, it makes it very difficult. So there's a certain level of insecurity there, to bring it back to where it is that I started. There's a certain level of insecurity there, because the thought process is, if she doesn't need me for this, 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 and this, and those three things, because it's really just three things, it's money, sex, and stability. In today's environment, she can make her own money, which creates her own stability, which means that she doesn't necessarily need you for those two things. And all you can do is really provide the sex, and she can basically get that anywhere.
Yes. With a
So where does
charging
that
battery.
Either that, right? And so, it's like, or she doesn't, or because she is working so hard to do all of these things on her own, she doesn't have time to worry about, one, your ego, or two, your needs from her. She doesn't have time or space to actually worry about those things, because she's busy maintaining all of these things. And I'm not trying to suggest that men are undeserving of emotional support and all of that. I'm just saying that it is about. So if she is the primary breadwinner, then it may be beneficial for you to take, for you, that being man, person, or other significant person in the situation, to take that step back if you are not necessarily doing the primary breadwinning, to provide the additional support to balance things out so that she doesn't have to do those things.
Yes.
Right? Because that's the other part of a dynamic. The reason why we call it a dynamic is not because, you know, it's one person carrying everything. A family dynamic requires actual teamwork. It requires dynamism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a word for you.
Okay.
So it requires you to actually not be unique, so to speak, but to actually be dynamic. And being able to be dynamic is all about how it is that you can function with others to make things work. You know, being an individual is not helpful. Being quote unquote independent is not helpful on either side, where you are so fiercely independent that you have no needs for anybody, and then you end up burning out and not being able to function in a relationship because you've been doing this for so long by yourself. You could do bad all by yourself. That doesn't help anybody. That doesn't help you. Right. And so we have to take a step back and learn how to actually work dynamically with each other. Starting with things like the communication, going into things like recognizing, okay, we're living in a different time, which means that we have to act differently. Expecting our young boys and men to do the things on their own, or to, you know, suck it up, or whatever it is, you know, quote unquote, man up, or whatever terminology you want to use, that basically means the only person whose emotional health that matters is the woman. That's not working either.
Yes.
That's toxic masculinity at its best, coming from the female side. And so if you are one of those women who thinks that man folk are acting like too much like girls, you might want to leave that alone, because you're not helping yourself either. You are perpetuating an imbalance that does not serve any of us. If you are raising your boys to be a certain way, and raising your girls to be a certain way, but not recognizing that the certain way that you're raising them is according to a set of rules that no longer applies, you're going to have a next generation that is even more confuddled than this one. So we have to start doing things differently. We have to start recognizing what the dynamic really is, what actually functional family dynamics are about, because we're evolving. We have evolved. We have changed. And the definition of what family is has also changed. And we have to start moving towards what that actually means in a way that actually works. It didn't work back then either. It didn't work back then either. Okay? What you're looking at didn't work back then either. If it was really working, then it wouldn't have had to change. For hundreds, if not, no, let me not even, since the beginning of time, okay? The reason why there are literally more women on the planet than there are men isn't just because literally there are more women born on the planet than there are men. Yes, statistical fact, more women are born than men, but also because we have these terrible ideas that the ones who are supposed to go out to war are the men. And what's even worse is that we send the youngest, best, and strongest out there to do it. And so throughout history, we have completely decimated generations of young men.
Yes.
So that the only ones who are coming back are hardened, I don't want to say broken, but definitely damaged individuals who inflict said damage upon the young who they created in the breaks between us. And I'm not talking about, since 9/11. I'm literally talking about since the dawn of time. Since the dawn of time, this is how we have treated each other. We have sent our boys out there to die. Whoever gets to somehow manage to come back gets to come back and breed. And then we repeat the cycle as if that worked. I mean, sure, it got us here, right? And I'm not necessarily one to judge because it got us this far into humanity. But at the same time, we have to recognize that right now we're in a situation where we are because of the levels of dysfunction that happened for eons before we got to where we are today. So family dynamics, function versus dysfunction, just to bring it back to a full circle kind of moment. Whatever you were thinking it was probably wrong. And what we actually need to be doing is redefining what a functional family dynamic is based on the situations that we have immediately. And when I say based on the situations that we have immediately, I mean my situation is going to be different from their situation. It's going to be different from that situation. It's going to be different from the other one situation. And not using that to compare anymore, because the way how today's world works is so both unique and dynamic across the board. It literally requires all kinds to make things work. Now we have this situation since COVID where some of us have to work from home while other of us have to go out to do things, and others still tired between the two, right? Some of us, so I translate what the situation is, some of us have to be relatively isolated to just being with our immediate circles all the time, right? Because we're stuck at home. So we only have the people who we work at home with. Others of us have going out there to go and also work with other human beings out there and interacting out there. I still have a little bit of the both, where it's that teeter-totter seesaw balancing act. And so as a social community, even that, how we socialize is changing, because we're not getting to, we'll say, flex that muscle as much anymore. I mean, I'll take it personal, and and I'm not picking on you, Dana, but it just works in this particular moment. But once upon a time, we used to actually get together like once a month, like see each other in person. We'd go to the meetups. There'd be social things to do. We'd be going to the game thingy or hanging out at, I don't think I should probably mention any names of places where we would go, because but we go to those places,
nerdy places, fun places,
right? Fun places to do fun nerd stuff, and but that was all in person, right? You know, we would have things to look forward to, and I'd get the invite from the nerd group, and I'm like, yep, I'll be there. We get to have the interaction on the interwebs first, and then we'd go out there and we'd actually be like, hey, and actually seeing people in person, right?
Yep.
It's been like 11 years, aka since 22 or 2020. Since 2020, since we could really do that on a regular basis.
Exactly. And it's like slowly getting back right now. Slowly.
Like molasses slow. But that's where we are right now. We're all I mean, I confess that going out there and being among, like Ariel said, I want to be where the people are. But do I really?
Mm-hmm. It's that grass isn't green on the other
Right?
side until you get over there.
The only reason it's greener is because it's spray painted. Spray, man. It's the
It's
AstroTurf. All
artificial
right.
grass. That's why.
Yeah, that's why. But yeah, it's this is what socialization has become. This is where we've evolved to, and the quote unquote new normal is going to continue changing, and
Yeah.
we have to learn how to change with it. So when we
Mm-hmm.
are redefining what our functional family dynamics are, what we really need to be looking for are the elements of things that don't work. So that's the things
Yes.
that say we're not properly communicating our needs or our wants, or our concerns or our feelings, right? Or our thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the most abstract thought is the best thought to share because that's the one that will bring us closer.
Mm-hmm.
People think that their abstract thoughts should stay in their head, kept private because that's crazy and to hear these weird thoughts. No, share your more abstract thoughts. Believe it or not, as I have experienced as mental health, abstract often shared by many others. And those are the things that will actually bring you closer as opposed to causing more distance.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in these times where we're looking for ways to become more social, but we're not necessarily quite ready yet to be more social.
Yeah.
Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's so we have to start redefining these things. We have to start
Mm-hmm.
looking at what actually works for where we are, because our things have changed a lot and they're going to continue changing a lot.
Yes.
Right? We're not completely past this COVID age.
Yes.
Any day now, we're knock on fake wood. We're going to be in some new pandemic situation, or
Because that's how
my fellow
viruses
nerds out
act.
there, we're okay. My fellow nerds, we have all been collectively in one way, shape, or form or another, been preparing for the zombie apocalypse, because that's what we do. We all have our zombie apocalypse plan, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But how many actually took our zombie apocalypse plan seriously when it came to the pandemic? Just saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to actually, find our friends who we know that we would be looking for in the zombie apocalypse. We
Mm-hmm.
just technically had a zombie apocalypse, and instead of doing what it is that the zombie apocalypse plan suggested, most of us either were going to shelter in place as suggested, or we were going to move and travel somewhere else to where things were safer.
Yeah.
And that, okay, some people did manage to shelter in place, sort of. I definitely moved through 3 states. I'm not even gonna lie. Right? But once I got there, I sheltered.
Yes.
So it's a thing, but it's so important to recognize that the way how you plan for the next pandemic has to include how you're going to be or function in your family. And I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned this part because your family isn't just your mother, brother, cousin, uncle, auntie, grandpa, daughter, son.
Mm-hmm.
Your family is also your best friend.
Yes.
Family is also your dog. Your
Mm-hmm.
family is also that person who you see every time you go to the place where you go the most often.
Mm-hmm.
Your family is also your very favorite coworker.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. But okay, if you have a work husband, work wife, that can be your
Yep.
family too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so whoever that is, that's your family. And how
Yeah.
you function in the family, that's going to matter, and how you get through the next, either the next however long we're still all coping with COVID, or the next, I don't know, COVID 20.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we're going to be working toward if we're talking about functioning as a global family.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're working toward right now, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about dynamics is, well, one, because in this particular phase of my career, I'm working with children and families, and not with the Department of Children and Families, but I'm working with children and families, and I'm getting to see so many different family or forms of family dynamics, most of which are existing in a very extreme state, but believe it or not, however extreme, are still to a certain extent within the realm of what can be considered expected.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when we take into account the last 3 years of trauma that the entire world went through.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at the reality of things, a lot of us, especially as grown-ups, are expecting a certain level of behavior, or we're expecting a certain level of change or flexibility or inflexibility or whatever, because we are in a state of grief. We're in a state of flux. We're in a state of change, and we are resisting extra hard, just to put it really simply. And I say we because it's really important to be all inclusive.
Yeah.
You might be doing things better or less dysfunctionally than others, but for the most part, we're all kind of fighting where we are tooth and nail.
Yeah.
In one way or another, we're all just trying to keep our heads afloat, while also in some cases holding on to what was. And that is not helping. So these families that I'm seeing in so many different ways are fighting some of the natural progression of what's going to happen in a family in this particular state, which is actually causing more discord. Today's teenagers have grown up in an age where getting shot up at school is a regular thought. They have school shooting drills.
Yep.
They have literally trauma built into their curriculum.
Yeah.
Not avoiding trauma, but actually experiencing trauma and managing it on a regular daily basis. They are not being traumatized by bullies. They're being traumatized by teachers, school officials, governmental officials, whatever, trying to so-called protect them. So when today's teenagers are acting a bit angsty, which is by our count of people who were teenagers 20 years or so ago, that's a lot. What is happening here? That's too much. Well, they live a much more extreme level than we did. And so, of course, when you have to exist at a more extreme level, your behaviors are going to be more extreme. It's going to be more difficult to moderate to a lesser level when your actual existence, your environment has now punched it up a notch.
Yeah.
Or 12. That's where they are. And the expectation is that they would still be acting like we did. We're technically, the only school shooting that most of us had any immediate interaction with was Columbine.
Yep.
Columbine.
Look how long that was between then and the shootings now versus today. At least minimum once a year, we're hearing something. If it makes it to the national news.
Month. I heard about a school shooting like 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And if they're not shooting up the schools, they're shooting up the movie theaters. They're shooting up the like places where it's just like, remember back in the day where the joke was to go postal because the postal workers were losing their minds?
Yes. Because that was the saying. It's like, oh, they went postal. They're going postal. Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there was probably only back then, like maybe there was maybe just the one postal worker who ever did
Yeah.
anything, right?
That just snapped, and that was it. They were it. That was it.
Just the one.
But it went national, and then everybody
It
knew
became
about it.
that if there was memes back then, that it would have been a postal meme.
Yeah. But
Right?
it's fascinating with that, how you talk about that, because with the feelings and all this trauma, a lot of people you see online are talking about all, everybody's so focused on feelings, families and people have become soft. And it's a misconceived notion of people being able to express their feelings healthy wise that is considered soft, is considered we're damaging the family dynamic by being this way. Fathers hugging and kissing on their kids is is gay. It's something's wrong with him. So like those elements of feelings, as far as the misconceived notion for men, how can we battle that for so long men were told as kids, um, you know, tough it up, don't cry, you can't cry, man up, all this kind of stuff. And then now they have this all bottled up inside of them. But if they see another man expressing love or any kind of emotion, something's wrong. You're destroying the black family. You're destroying this because you're being too soft.
Look at the suicide rates. Look at the instances of suicide in Black communities. The reason why the suicide, well, not the reason, one reason why the suicide rate has gone up, I would suppose, is also because what used to happen instead is that we just weren't living that long to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They were killing our young Black men, so they didn't get the chance to kill themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But now that we're getting to live that long and having to deal with the trauma and the abuse and the vicarious trauma of watching I Can't Breathe, or, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go too much further than that, but you know what I mean. Having to deal with that, having to deal with the prospect of living in this world the way how it is, because, we like to say that it's a United States problem, but, let me get personal for a moment. My cousins in Costa Rica right now are, and these are young kids, as of yesterday, were taken from my uncle's home because they go to a predominantly, we'll say, pale person school.
Mm-hmm.
And they are the only brown people. It just so happens to be that there's a lot of them. So, but they're the only brown people going to their school, and the teachers don't like it.
Oh.
And so they have reported, they lied. They called my uncle and they called my mom, because she's on the list of emergency contacts, and claimed that my younger cousin was arrested yesterday for assaulting her. Claimed. So when my uncle
Mm-hmm.
shows up, thinking that he's going to have to pick up my cousin for assaulting a child and what, right? They arrested my uncle, claiming that arrested of abuse, and they were taking all of the children from his custody and making them a ward of the state or of the country or whatever you would call them there in Costa Rica. They'd be removed and be separated from each other and shipped off to different parts of the country. Racial profiling at its best.
Mm-hmm.
In Costa Rica.
Yeah.
Where there are people who are literally leaving the United States right now to escape the U.S. level of racism and racial injustice. And I'll just be full disclosure with it. The paler Costa Ricans are not happy that so many of us are going there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's where my family's from, by the way. So it's not like we went there and as immigrants. No, my Costa Rica cousins are born there. They don't speak English, so forth, so on, and that is the reality that they're dealing with right now. So racism is not unique to the U.S.
Yes.
or English-speaking countries. It's a global thing. Brown people, and especially the darker brown people, are not appreciated in much of this world. And so having to go out there and deal with that and exist in this kind of world where your sense of self is highly determined by your survival rate. You want to ask me about whether or not we're getting soft. Sure, we can call it that. Or we could admit that the world is harder.
Yes.
And we're having a hard time catching up, as per the earlier conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because no, we're not necessarily dealing with Jim Crow, but instead we're dealing with microaggressions, like our children being snatched out of our homes, and we're getting accused of child abuse so that the paler people don't have to deal with our children. Or last month, the court case also in Costa Rica of the paler teacher. And the reason I say paler is, of course, because we're talking about Costa Rica, which means that these are also people who would be considered a part of the BIPOC community. These would be Latinos. And so they are inflicting damages upon the darker of us because they're not comfortable with it. They don't like it.
Yeah.
And so, no, I'm going to hard pass on all of that. We need to be teaching our boys to cry. We need to be teaching our girls to allow space for men to actually emote.
Yes.
And have more emotions than just anger. We need to be teaching our children, period, that it is okay to feel and experience and display emotions that are more than just anger. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel hurt. It's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to experience the entire spectrum of emotional language. Because it's been 50 million years and then some, and we're still acting as if emotions are unnatural when that's our first language, literally.
Yeah.
The first language a baby comes out with is emotion. They don't have the spoken language. All they have is emotion. All they understand is emotion. It's our first language. There's nothing more natural and more necessary than our emotional intelligence.
Yes.
So if you want a better world where Black boy magic or Black boy joy or, Black women's hard work, because calling it magic is inaccurate AF. It took work to get here, okay, y'all? So it wasn't just poof. All right, it took work. So it's important to recognize that our emotional selves are valid. And if you want to not feel emotion and not experience emotion, well, go join David Koresh and the rest of the, as we would say, crazy white people in their shit. Because that's what you get when you don't actually properly emote. Either you kill yourself or you kill a whole bunch of other people. Pick one.
Yeah.
Because that's how that works. It's, by definition, the only thing that's quote unquote gay is actually having homosexual sex. Anything else, it's just human beings being human.
Yes.
Like I am flabbergasted that it is 2023 and we're still having this conversation. As a matter of fact, I feel like the conversation has escalated into things that can be considered suspiciously gay when we actually know what gay is now.
Yeah.
Like we actually have a real definition and we're still trying to pluck things out as if any of that is necessary. Learn how to exist as yourself and not manage what these other external expectations are being put upon you. Because if we want to exist as a functional dynamic, that is what today's world requires of us. We cannot continue going back to or trying to go back to a dynamic that didn't even work back then.
Exactly. Well, everyone, this is only the first part of this conversation because, of course, Shae is going to dive deeper into the different types of dynamics as we go further into this conversation the upcoming months. So as you see the posts about the upcoming episodes, get your questions together. Once again, as I mentioned before, if it's something you cannot say on a public platform because it's too close to home, message her on her socials that we have posted saying, hey, I need to set an appointment and get that appointment and have that discussion so you can kind of navigate from this determining what's dysfunctional and what's functional in your family dynamic. So we thank all of you for tuning in tonight. And of those who are watching this on the replay, definitely like, subscribe, and share with anyone else you feel needs to hear this conversation. And definitely tune in about 25 minutes. We're going to have our 8:30 p.m. Eastern panel. Our Moana Nui After Dark panel is going to be talking about John Wick Chapter 4. So definitely tune in for that conversation. If you've seen the movie, they're going to dive into it. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all in about 25 minutes. All right, everyone. Bye, everyone.
So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can't keep history on the shelf. If we won't tell it, we will.
If this the land of the free, it was a freedom then. When they annexed Hawaii and called it Cedar Lands, without any type of payment and no signing off. Called themselves the Republic in 1894. 1.2 million acres overtaken from the native Hawaiians. When they resisted, the West retaliated in violence and erasure. The Hawaiian language is banned as part of colonialism's plan to expand,
Stuck between a rock and a hard place. Multiple bombings of Kaho'olawe as a part of their ongoing war with Asia. Used it as a place for target practice. No consent or compensation. Colonizers call for annexation. Never cover all the locals, school will never let you know. So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf, if we won't tell it we will. Too many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf, if we won't tell it we will. We will.
So if we put Hawaii into perspective, well, Black and Asian history is interconnected. Considering the fight with the Pacific, then of course versus Asia, they was treated as a middleman for war, but didn't let the Western colorism run its course. Cause dark skin was a sign of dignity to core. The land was taken in the name of capitalism, when prior to it was an actual kingdom. Clap back at the system.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place. Multiple bombings of Kaho'olawe as a part of their ongoing war with Asia. Used it as a place for target practice. No consent or compensation. Colonizers call for annexation. Never cover all the locals, school will never let you know. So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf, if we won't tell it we will. Too many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf, if we won't tell it we will. So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf, if we won't tell it we will. Too many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf, if we won't tell it we will. We will.